Okay, so this presentation is about copyright. First, let's start with a little story. Here are some quotes. Kim says he was kneed in the ribs, punched in the face, and his hand was stepped on until his nails bled. Cops were everywhere, in uniform, out of uniform, some with body armor, most with Bushmaster rifles or tactical semi-automatics. What were the charges, he asked. The answer surprised him. Copyright infringement. So these excerpts are from a true story. It's about a guy named Kim.com. Yes, that's his real name. Kim.com he legally changed his name to Kim.com. He was a former German hacker, and he created a website called Mega Upload, which he thought was legitimate. It was basically a website where people could store files. So .com claims that the site did not promote or condone any illegal file sharing. For example, people uploading copyrighted music, film, software, games, things like that. However, that is what the site was predominantly used for. Kim.com and his company were held accountable for contributing to copyright infringement, so much so that the U.S. government raided his home in New Zealand because recent copyright legislation broadened the scope, and so now there are international laws that allow things like the U.S. government to raid a guy's home in New Zealand. So what is copyright? Why is it so important? How did this all begin? Well, in 1440, a guy named Johannes Gutenberg remixed and combined a couple of existing inventions. He took movable type, which was invented in China a few centuries earlier. Basically, they're little letter stamps. And he took those and combined them with a drill press, which was used to make things like wine and hard cider. Kind of makes you wonder what inspired his creativity. And so he combined these two things and he invented what was called the first printing press. So it was basically a machine that could do a bunch of stampings in an efficient and mechanical way, and it was used to copy texts. In the 1500s, chaos ensued. People were printing stuff like crazy. Authors were taking credit for things that other people wrote, but more importantly, some political pamphlets were beginning to circulate, and literacy was increasing in Europe, which was good, but some people thought that this was a problem. So, later on in the 1500s, both the Catholic Church and the British government, they were nervous about the people reading some of these political pamphlets and possibly starting a revolt. They wanted to control the information that was being disseminated among the people, because it would allow them to better control them. So under Pope Alexander VI, the Catholic Church produced a list of allowable texts that could be published and copied, according to them. And under Henry VIII, the British government at the time created the Guild of Stationers, which was basically a group of publishers who would enforce the list of allowable texts and control what could and could not be copied. In 1709, the political climate was a little bit different. So fast forward a couple hundred years. Western civilization was entering the Age of Enlightenment, and intellectual pursuits were encouraged. So in order to promote the advancement of knowledge and progress, the Statute of Anne was created as an incentive for people to have exclusive rights to their written works, and this lasted for 14 years. This was considered to be the origin of modern copyright law. In 1790 in the U.S., the Copyright Act of 1790 was created by folks like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington had a hand in that as well. So this was intended to secure the author's exclusive rights as a way to promote the advancement of scholarship, art, and science. Over the years, copyright terms have been extended quite a bit. Now, copyright guarantees exclusive publishing rights to a work for today's copyright law is for 95 years after the publication, or 120 years after the creation of the works, or 70 years after the author's death. Whatever is longest or easiest to figure out. Why so long? Well, one argument is that it maximizes the profit for companies who own the copyright, such as Disney. Legislation has been revised over the years to accommodate new forms of technology in media. For example, the 1976 Copyright Revision Act considered new considerations presented by what they called at the time phono recordings or phono records, and later on the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is more commonly known as the DMCA, introduced laws that accommodate companies' use of digital rights management tools. That's also known as DRM tools. You may have heard of that. And the DMCA also covered internet distribution concerns with this new medium. Now, I would argue that the DMCA is a little bit out of date because, again, this was written in 1998 and the internet wasn't nearly as expansive as it is today. Some interesting cases around copyright. Sony versus Universal is one, and this is also called the Betamax case. And what happened in Sony versus Universal is that Universal and Disney were concerned about the copying of films and TV shows, and so they sued Sony. So the Betamax was kind of an early precursor to VHS cassette tapes. In fact, that was the original format war, was Betamax versus VHS. VHS obviously won. But with the invention of Betamax, it was easy to copy things from TV, or if you had two Betamax cassette players hooked up to each other, you could copy one to the other, and so Sony and Universal was concerned about copying. The court ruled that it's fair use to make an archive for kind of, if you bought a video, then you can make a copy for yourself. So you hear this argument brought up a lot. If people buy a CD, they think that they can make an archive on their computer for personal use. They're probably referring to this precedent that was set by Sony versus Universal. A few justices did dissent because they recognized the potential for this copying thing to get out of hand and be abused, and for piracy to kind of take hold. The player piano is also an interesting case. It has an interesting role in the history of copyright, and specifically has to do with royalties. Player pianos prompted Congress to consider the role of mechanical reproductions of creative works. They developed a law that guarantees royalties or small payments to the artist or author of such works. So every time a piano roll was produced, a portion of the profits went to the composer. Another interesting case is Righthaven. Now, Righthaven doesn't exist anymore, but it was around for a few years, actually a few years ago. And what they did is they scoured the internet looking for copyrighted images on websites and blogs and things like that. And if they found any, they would contact the site owner and threaten to sue or settle out of court for a fee somewhere in the few $1,000s range. Now, this company and others like it are called copyright trolls, or patent trolls is another example if they're looking for infringing patents of inventions. Pinterest originally had some odd language in its terms of use. Some of you have probably heard of Pinterest. It's a photo sharing site. One Pinterest user was an amateur photographer, but she was also a lawyer. And so she looked at Pinterest's terms of use at the time, and she canceled her account because she felt that the terms of use were contradictory. What she saw in them is that they said that she cannot use Pinterest to promote her own works, so her own photography, but she also couldn't use it to post the works of others that she just found on the web. And so she read that and thought, well, what can I use it for? Nothing. So since then, Pinterest has revised its terms of use, and it's allowed for more flexibility, so people can, for example, post their own works and photos and things on it. But it's also partnered with some online image clearinghouses that either have royalty-free images or some type of watermark or something like that that appropriately cites the copyright of the image that's being posted. Now, you may have come across these two organizations called the RIAA and the MPAA. That stands for Recording Industry Association of America and the Motion Picture Association of America. And what they've done in recent years is they've gone after the websites, like file sharing websites, and they've gone after companies like Napster, and they've even targeted individual users that have used these sites because they've violated copyright by sharing files. In one particular case, this was MGM versus Grokster. Grokster claimed that they simply hosted a website. This is kind of like Kim.com and his mega upload site. Grokster said that they just had a website and they weren't accountable for the way that people were using it and the content that people were sharing on the site. Well, they actually lost the case and MGM won because MGM obviously recognized that people were sharing entire films on this Grokster file sharing website. The inventors of the BitTorrent protocol attempted to circumvent the law by providing a mechanism, a file sharing process, that they actually broke the files into little pieces, and they used lots of different people who were considered seeders that are seeding the files, and so then you're just kind of one person in this network that's assembling all the little pieces and bits into the complete file through an algorithm. And so the original BitTorrent inventors felt that this wasn't a one-to-one kind of file copying process. It was just little fragments. And so it was like hopefully what they thought was a loophole in the law or a workaround. However, recent court cases have found that that's not true, and people are actually losing cases if they're using BitTorrent to illegally copy copyrighted materials. Several years ago, when file sharing sites like Kazaa, Napster, and LimeWire were popular, a woman named Jamie Thomas was unfortunately caught sharing a couple dozen or so popular rock songs. Capitol Records, with the help from the RIAA, decided to make an example of her, and they sued her for nearly $2 million. They claimed that amount was justified because of the internet sharing and how that leads to loss of sales. Now, I think since then what they settled for something around $50,000, but still, that was a pretty high amount for what most people think is fairly innocuous activity of sharing files. Fair use is an exception to copyright laws. Fair use includes examples of how content can be used or repurposed without violating copyright. Some examples include education or satire. There are several factors that determine whether the copyrighted content falls under fair use or not. They are that the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of commercial nature or non-profit, for example, educational purposes. So are you making a copy because you intend to make money, or are you using it for non-profit purposes? That's one of the criteria. The nature of the copyrighted work. So is this really like an educational content, or is it something that's used for entertainment? The amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the work as a whole. So if I use 10%, then that's probably more in favor of fair use as opposed to if I used 80% of a work. And then the effect of the use upon the potential market. So getting back to the Jamie Thomas case, if I'm copying something, is that going to possibly reduce the potential sales of a work? And so these are all the things that are considered when looking at whether making a copy is within the realm of the fair use exceptions. Slightly more specific to education is the TEACH Act of 2002. That was a piece of legislation that increased the ability for educators to use copyrighted content without violating copyright law. And part of the reason for that is because of the growth of things like online courses and distance education. And so the TEACH Act was created to accommodate students who are taking online courses that should get the equivalent experience of students that are taking a course that in a face-to-face environment. Similar to copyright are what are called patents and trademarks. Now, a patent is something that you apply to inventions or processes, and the term for that is 17 years from the issue of the patent. And trademarks apply to things like logos, patterns, or visual representations. In some case, names or phrases or even sounds have been trademarked. The term is indefinite as long as it is continually registered and as long as it's used, too. So if a company has a trademark, they have to keep using it as part of their brand, and they have to keep renewing the trademark registration. So speaking of trademarks, I used to do technology workshops that I called Taco Tuesday Tech Talks. And then the university got a cease and desist letter from Taco John's about the use of the term Taco Tuesday. And so I changed it to Tech-O Tuesday instead to not violate the trademark. In the software world, there's something called open source. This means that the code behind the software is freely available for others to augment, reverse engineer, or borrow. The concept of open source is embraced by organizations such as the Free Software Foundation. They think that all software should be free, since the purpose of any computer software is to advance the progress of mankind. Sharing is common in the software and technology world, so patents can get messy sometimes. Apple and Samsung, you may have seen in the news, they've been suing each other for years all around the world. It's like a Hatfields and McCoy kind of thing. They're just chasing each other around, suing each other for patent infringement. And in the LMS world, so D2L is considered an LMS. You may have heard of Blackboard. And in fact, these two companies have also sued each other for patent infringement. Often in patent suits, something called prior art is discussed, and that refers to what inventions or concepts existed prior to the patent being registered. So if an invention existed before, but the people that originally invented it maybe never applied for a patent, then that would be considered prior art, and it would actually render the patent ineligible in lawsuits like this. Creative Commons is an alternative to and in addition to traditional copyright laws. It allows authors and creators to grant more flexibility to how their content is being used. There are 4 types of Creative Commons licenses, which can be used in combination. The most basic is called the attribution license. This just means that credit needs to be given to the original author. Share alike means that future users of the content need to license the content with the same Creative Commons license that the original author put on it. No derivatives means that people can't alter the content, and non-commercial means that people can't try to make money off of the work. So that was copyright in a nutshell.